Hello, my favorite English language learners. It's your favorite English teacher here, Amy Joy. And whether you are studying for the TOEFL, taking college courses, or are just interested in current events, then you need to know how to talk about history and time. So in today's video, I'm going to teach you 20 advanced and super useful words, all related to history and time, so that you can sound more like a native English speaker when talking about these topics. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first word here is timeline. Timeline. A timeline is a line that shows the order of events. So here on our timeline, you can see World War I happened first, followed by the Roaring Twenties, then the Great Depression, and then World War II. And on our timeline, these events are ordered chronologically. They are in chronological order. This is our next word, chronological, chronological. And the adverb, chronologically, chronologically, chronologically. Both of these words mean in the order of time. For example, you might see some directions on a test or quiz saying, on your quiz, list the events in chronological order. Or in a history essay, it makes sense to order your paragraphs chronologically. In your first paragraph, you talk about the first event. In the second paragraph, you talk about the second event, and so on. You are listing the events in the order of time or chronologically. Next, we have the adverb previously. Previously, previously. This describes something that happened before the current time or another event. For example, before the Europeans came to the Americas, native tribes had previously lived there. The native tribes lived there before the Europeans came. They had lived there previously. Or in another example, previously the land was used for farming, but after the Industrial Revolution, factories were built there. So previously or before, the land was used for farming, but then the Industrial Revolution happened and factories were built. And our next word, currently, currently. This describes something happening right now. For example, the mummies from Egyptian tombs are currently displayed in museums around the world. The mummies are in the museums right now. Or you can say, currently in 2024, we are in an election year. Who do you think is going to win the 2024 election? And moving on, we have the adverb traditionally, traditionally, traditionally. This describes the way people have done something for a long time, but maybe it has changed or is different now. For example, in ancient Egypt, pharaohs were traditionally buried in pyramids. That was a tradition then, but does not currently happen now. Or in another example, traditionally men worked and earned money, and women stayed home with children. But this is currently changing. These gender roles were part of a tradition or a way of doing something for a long time, but using the word traditionally means that that was a way of doing something in the past, and now things are changing. Next is this prepositional phrase, prior to, plus a noun or gerund, or the ing form. And prior to simply means before. So in a sentence we can say, prior to World War II, many countries were struggling with economic depression. Prior to World War II, which is a noun, many countries were struggling with economic depression. This just means before World War II, many countries were struggling. Or in another example, prior to declaring independence, the colonies attempted to negotiate with Britain. Prior to or before declaring, notice that ing, that's the gerund form. Prior to declaring independence, the colonies attempted to negotiate with Britain. Makes sense, right? Okay, let's move on to talking about length and duration, or how long something lasts. And our next word here is to span in the verb form, and a span of, which is the noun form. A span of, a span of. To span means to last, and a span of means the length of time that an event or period lasts. Let's look at some examples. World War I spanned 4 years and resulted in 17 million deaths. Notice here, World War I is our subject and spanned is the verb. And instead of spanned, we could also say lasted. World War I lasted 4 years and resulted in 17 million deaths. And we can also say the span of World War I was 4 years. The span of World War I was 4 years. This means the length of time of World War I was 4 years. Now we actually have some other phrases and collocations with this word. For example, lifespan is how long a person lives. I think in the US, the average lifespan is around 78 years old. That is the average amount of time that someone lives. We also have the collocation attention span. Attention span. This means how long you can pay attention to something. And we often hear that our attention spans are rapidly decreasing with the use of social media and our phones and just being able to scroll on by things that we're not interested in. If you have a short attention span, you cannot pay attention for a long period of time. And if you have a long attention span, you can pay attention or focus for a long period of time. Now, coming back to talking about history, we often see the phrase over the span of plus a time. Over the span of. Over the span of. This means over the period of time. For example, we can say, over the span of 4 years, 17 million people died in World War I. Or an example from your everyday life, you might hear, over the span of the next few weeks, we will focus on essay number 2. Over the span of. Over the span of. Now, another useful phrase we use to talk about length and duration is this construct, a blank year long or a blank year old plus a noun. For example, the 4-year-long war resulted in 17 million deaths. Or the 500-year-old building was destroyed. Or she has a 7-month-old daughter. Now, there is a super common mistake that I always see my students make with this fixed phrase, and that is to make it plural. So oftentimes I see my students say something like the 4-years-long war, or the 500-years-old building, or the 7-months-old daughter. Now, whenever there is a noun at the end, like war, building, or daughter, we do not make the month or the year plural. And this is because the phrase 4-year-long or 500-year-old or 7-month-old is acting as an adjective describing the noun that comes after it. And in English, unlike some other languages, we don't make our adjectives plural. So be very careful when using this phrase. If you see a noun at the end of that phrase, do not make it plural. Just say 4-year-long, 500-year-old, or 7-month-old, and you will be correct. Now, the reason this can be so confusing is because if there is not a noun at the end, then we do make those words plural, but that is a separate discussion for another video. Let's move on to discussing periods of time. Here we have the word decade, decade, and this is a period of 10 years coming from the Greek root deca, which means 10. For example, the 1920s was a decade of economic success in the United States. Or, I feel like I have been studying English for decades. And similarly, we have the word century, which is a period of 100 years, coming from the root cent, which means 100. For example, the 18th century, which is 1700 to 1799, the 19th century, which is 1800 to 1899, and the 20th century, which is 1900 to 1999. Now, these are all a little bit confusing because the number of the century is always one greater than the years they represent. 18 is one more than 17, 19 is one more than 18, 20 is one more than 19. And this is because the first century was from year 1 to year 100. So always know that whatever century you're in will be one greater than the year that you are in. And this can even be confusing for native English speakers, but it is very useful to know. So in a sentence we can say, the internet was invented in the 20th century. It was invented in the 1900s. Now, notice my use of the word the in my previous examples. The internet was invented in the 20th century. The 20th century. The 20th century. And the 1920s was a decade of economic success in the United States. The 1920s, the 1920s, the 1920s. Something I see my students struggle with is knowing when to use the or when to omit or leave out the word the when talking about time and years and decades. So let me explain. We always say in the plus the number of the century, in the second, in the third, in the 20th century. Or if you want to talk about a general period of time that possibly ranges, maybe an entire decade or an entire century, you will say in the plus the plural form, in the 1920s or in the 1800s, in the plus the plural form. But you will not use the word the when talking about one single specific year. So we say in 1925, in 1800, in 2024. So the common mistake that I often see my students make is saying something like in 1800s to talk about the entire century. You need to say in the 1800s. Or they will say in 19th century to talk about the century as a whole. Or they might say in the 1925 instead of in 1925 in that one single specific year. I know using the word the can be super difficult, so make sure you take notes on this and commit it to your memory so you don't make the same mistakes that I see my students make all the time. Now, our last four words are era, age, period, and chapter. Now, all of these words can be used interchangeably or as synonyms to mean a span or length of time known for special characteristics, features, or historical events. For example, the Renaissance was an era, age, period, or chapter of great cultural and artistic achievement. The Renaissance was a specific period of time known for the features or characteristics of art and renewed thinking. So we can use era, age, period, or chapter to refer to that period of time. Or we can say the invention of electricity began a new era, age, period, or chapter of technological advancement. Again, the invention of electricity began a new era, age, period, or chapter of technological advancement. Now let's look at these words individually really quick. First we have the word era, and this word has gone through a fun evolution over the last few years, especially with Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, which you might be familiar with. And Taylor Swift's Eras Tour celebrates all the different time periods and albums of her career. Originally, the word era was more academic and more formal, but now you will hear people using it more in a slang way to talk about a certain time of their life. For example, if you have just begun going to the gym, you might say, "I'm in my fitness era." Or if you have just started playing tennis, you might say, "I'm in my tennis era." Or if you have just started gardening, you can say, "I'm in my gardening era." So the word era still has maintained this academic and formal usage, especially in the context of history. But now you will also notice people using it in a more slang way to talk about recent hobbies or things they are interested in their life. And next, I am sure you know the word age to mean how old a person is. But we also use the word age to talk about a period of time. Now, when you think of the word period, you might think about the point at the end of a sentence. Now, notice how we use the period in grammar to mark a complete thought. It begins one part of the sentence and ends another. And this is the same thing in history. When we talk about a period of time, we are talking about from the beginning of one point to the end of another. And looking at the word chapter, we use this word to talk about specific periods of history metaphorically, like in a chapter in a book. So this is a little bit more of a creative usage of the word chapter to talk about a span or specific period in history. Okay, well there you have it, 20 useful advanced words and phrases to talk about history and time. I hope you feel more confident reading those TOEFL passages, writing history essays in college, and just talking about current events in general. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe to my channel so you can keep improving your English with me. I'll see you next time. Bye!